My mom invited my sister to her 60th birthday, but left me out because I look like my father. Her face went pale when I told her I was cutting her out of my life for good. Not because I had done anything wrong. Not because we had some huge fight. Not because I had hurt her or embarrassed her or refused to show up for her. She left me out because every time she looked at my face, she saw the man who destroyed her marriage. And the look on her face was priceless when I finally told her I was removing her from my life. I found out about the party through my cousin Nadia's Instagram story. I was sitting on my couch after work, scrolling without really paying attention, when I saw a quick video of her kitchen counter. There were grocery bags, a half-open box of decorations, and right there in the middle of the shot was an invitation. Diane's 60th family celebration. The date, the time, and my mother's house address were printed clearly enough for me to read before the story moved on. I replayed it 3 times, staring at the words like they might change if I looked hard enough. They did not. My mother was having a family birthday dinner, and somehow, everyone seemed to know about it except me. My sister Bryn called me that night pretending to check in about work. She made 20 minutes of small talk about deadlines, office drama, and whether I had finally fixed the dripping faucet in my kitchen. She was too casual, the way people get when they are trying too hard to sound normal. Then, like she was mentioning nothing important, she said she had a thing on Saturday. I asked, "What thing?" She paused for half a second too long and said, "Just some dinner." That was when I knew she knew. She knew exactly what dinner it was, and she was lying to me. I asked, "Is it Mom's birthday party?" There was silence on the other end of the phone. Then she said, "How did you find out?" I almost laughed because that was all the confirmation I needed. "So it's true," I said. "She invited everyone except me." Bryn immediately tried to soften it. "Maybe she just hasn't gotten around to inviting you yet." I said, "Bryn, the party is in 4 days." She sighed and said she did not want to get in the middle of it. That made something in me snap colder than anger. "You're already in the middle," I told her. "You're going to a party I'm not invited to." She asked me what I wanted her to do, and I said, "Not go. I want you to ask her why one of her children isn't invited." Bryn got quiet, and when she finally spoke, her voice sounded tired. "You know why." And the awful part was that she was right. Everyone knew why. I looked like my father. Same heavy brow, same gray eyes, same crooked smile. Every morning, the mirror showed me the face of the man who had blown up our family and walked away. My father cheated on my mother 15 years earlier. I was 12, and Bryn was 14. He left with the other woman, moved to Arizona, and started a new family like we were a bad draft he had decided to throw away. We had not seen him since. But somehow, even though he was the one who left, I became the reminder. Bryn looked enough like my mother to be safe. She had Diane's softer face, Diane's expressions, Diane's way of moving through a room like she belonged there. I looked like him, and from the time he left, my mother treated that resemblance like a crime I had committed on purpose. I drove to my mother's house that Thursday. She was in the garden, pulling weeds that probably did not need pulling, because she always found something to do with her hands when she wanted to avoid a conversation. I said, "Hey, Mom." She looked up, and her face tightened in the same way it always did when she saw me, like I was a bill she did not want to open. "What are you doing here?" she asked. I said, "Can I visit my mother?" She looked back down at the flower bed and said, "I'm busy." I stood there for a second, watching her dig at the dirt like the weeds were more deserving of attention than I was, and then I asked, "Are you having a party Saturday?" Her shoulders stiffened. She did not ask what I meant. She did not pretend she did not know. She just said, "Who told you?" "Does it matter?" I asked. "Why wasn't I invited?" She finally turned around and looked right at me with those cold eyes. "You know why?" I said, "No, I don't." Her mouth twisted like she hated that I was making her say it out loud. Then she said, "Every time I look at you, I see him. Same eyes, same mouth, same lying face." For a second, I could not even breathe. I told her, "I'm not him. I'm your child. I stayed. I chose you." She said it did not matter. According to her, I looked like him, sounded like him, even stood like him. I told her that was not my fault. She said, "I don't care whose fault it is. I can't have you there. Not for my birthday. Not with everyone watching and thinking about what he did." I reminded her that Bryn had the same father too. We were siblings. We both came from the same broken marriage. My mother looked back at the garden and said, "Bryn looks like me, acts like me. You're all him. Every gesture, every laugh, everything." Then she picked up her tools and said, "Please leave." I did not leave right away. I stood there, still waiting for her to take it back, because some childish part of me still believed that if I stayed long enough, she would remember she was my mother. I said, "Mom, I've been here every Mother's Day, every Christmas, every birthday, even when you barely acknowledged me." She did not look at me. She just said, "Leave." I sat in my car outside her house for almost an hour before I could drive away. I kept thinking about all the times she had looked through me like I was transparent. All the school events where she cheered for Bryn and barely clapped for me. The driving lessons she gave Bryn but not me, telling me I could figure it out myself. The dinners where she asked Bryn about her day and forgot to ask me anything at all. I had spent 15 years trying to be less of a reminder and more of a daughter, but my face had always walked into the room before I did. Saturday came, and I stayed home. I ordered pizza, turned on the TV, and tried not to think about what was happening at my mother's house. That did not work. Bryn texted me pictures from the party. I do not know why she thought that would help, but every photo felt like proof that I had been erased. Everyone was there. Aunts, uncles, cousins I had not seen in years. Even my grandmother Carol, who could barely travel anymore, had made the trip from Florida. In every picture, there was a space where I should have been. I should have been standing next to Bryn. I should have been hugging my grandmother. I should have been laughing with cousins and eating cake and pretending family did not still hurt. Instead, I was home alone because my face was wrong. Bryn called me Sunday morning and said, "It was weird without you." I asked, "Was it? But you still went." She said, "There aren't sides. She's our mother." I answered, "She's your mother. Apparently, I'm just a reminder of her ex-husband." Bryn told me that was not fair, and I almost lost it. "Fair?" I said. "She excluded me from a family party because of my genetics. Tell me what's fair about that." Bryn was silent for a while before she said, "She's hurting." "She's been hurting for 15 years. I said, "So have I. The difference is I didn't abandon my child over it." On Monday, I went back to Diane's house. This time, I did not knock. I used my key, the one she had forgotten I still had. She was sitting at the kitchen table, going through birthday cards, probably sorting thank you notes she would never send. Without looking up, she said, "Get out." I said, "No," and sat across from her. "You need to hear this." She kept staring at the cards, but I could see the tension in her jaw. I told her, "He did it to all of us. Bryn and I lost our father, but I also lost my mother. She's sitting right here, but she's been gone since I was 12. And you know what the worst part is? I kept trying. I kept showing up. I kept hoping that one day you would see me instead of him. I'm done trying to earn something that should have been free. Bryn can have you all to herself." That finally made her look at me. She asked, "Where are you going?" I gave her a tired smile and said, "Out of your life. I'm removing you from mine." Her face changed instantly, like she had not believed I was capable of saying it. But before I could say anything else, the room tilted. My head started spinning, the kitchen lights blurred, and everything went black. The last thing I saw was Diane's shocked face as she jumped up and ran toward me. I woke up on the kitchen floor with Diane leaning over me, her hands shaking as she touched my shoulder. Sirens wailed outside, getting louder, and I realized she must have called 911 while I was unconscious. The paramedics came through the front door seconds later, a woman with short blonde hair and a man with a beard, both carrying equipment bags. Diane scrambled back to give them room, and for once, she looked scared in a way I had never seen before. The female paramedic knelt beside me, pressed 2 fingers against my wrist, and asked my name and whether I knew where I was. I managed to answer, but my voice came out weak and scratchy. She checked my eyes with a small flashlight, asked me to follow her finger, then wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm while her partner set up equipment beside us. The male paramedic asked Diane about my medical history, medications, and known conditions. She stumbled through her answers and had to admit she did not actually know most of it. The female paramedic glanced at her with raised eyebrows, then looked back at me, clearly picking up on the tension in the room. When my blood pressure reading came through, she frowned and told her partner they needed to transport me. They brought in a stretcher, helped me onto it, and secured straps across my chest and legs. Diane followed them to the ambulance, asking if she could ride along. The male paramedic hesitated before nodding. They loaded me into the back, and the female paramedic climbed in with me while Diane sat on the side bench, pale and silent. The paramedic hooked me up to a heart monitor that beeped steadily, placed an oxygen mask over my face, and asked about chest pain and dizziness. I told her I had felt dizzy right before I passed out, but no chest pain. Mostly, I just felt overwhelmed and exhausted. Diane sat across from me with her hands gripping her knees. At one point, she reached toward me like she wanted to take my hand. Her arm stretched halfway across the space between us, fingers slightly open, and then she stopped. For several seconds, her hand just hung there in the air. Then she pulled it back and pressed both palms against her thighs. The ambulance turned corners, the siren cutting through traffic, and neither of us said a word. At the emergency room, they wheeled me through automatic doors into a bright hallway that smelled like antiseptic and floor cleaner. A nurse directed them to a curtained room, and they transferred me from the stretcher to a hospital bed. Diane followed but stayed near the doorway, looking lost and uncomfortable. A doctor came in a few minutes later, a tall man with gray hair and glasses, who introduced himself as Dr. Whitlock. He reviewed the paramedic's notes and examined me, checking my pulse, looking into my eyes, and listening to my heart and lungs. He asked pointed questions about what had happened before I collapsed, whether I had eaten that day, how much water I had had, and whether there had been recent stress in my life. His eyes kept moving between me and Diane. He clearly sensed something was wrong. Diane finally sat down in a corner chair, staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. Dr. Whitlock explained that I had experienced a severe stress-induced episode combined with dehydration and low blood sugar. A perfect storm, he called it, that caused my body to shut down. He said they needed to run tests and keep me for observation. A nurse came in with an IV kit, cleaned a spot on my arm, and slid the needle in with practiced efficiency. She taped it down, hung a bag of fluids on a pole, adjusted the drip rate, and told me I would need to stay for at least 4 hours while they monitored me and got fluids into my system. I closed my eyes because I was exhausted from everything, and then I heard footsteps approaching fast. Bryn's voice cut through the quiet. What happened? I opened my eyes and saw her standing at my bedside, still wearing the dress from the party weekend, her face tight with worry. She looked between me and Diane, waiting for an explanation. Diane finally said in a rough voice, she collapsed at my house. Bryn's expression shifted immediately. Her eyes narrowed at our mother because she knew there was more to the story than that. Bryn pulled Diane toward the door and motioned for her to step into the hallway. Even through the closed door, I could hear their voices rising. Bryn demanded to know what had been said before I collapsed. Diane insisted I had shown up and started accusing her of things. Bryn's voice got louder as she told Diane that excluding me from the party was cruel, and that everyone there had felt uncomfortable about my absence. Their argument blurred together until footsteps approached again, and Marin appeared in the doorway holding my phone charger and a bag from my apartment. Marin was my closest friend, the kind of person who did not need a long explanation to understand when something was bad. She looked through the door window at Diane, then back at Bryn, and asked, "Is she the reason you're here?" Bryn nodded and Marin's jaw tightened, but instead of engaging with the hallway drama, she came straight to my bedside. She asked what I needed, and whether I wanted Diane to leave. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were hard. I told her I did not have the energy to deal with Diane right now, and my voice cracked on the words. Marin walked to the mid-door, opened it, and asked Diane politely but firmly to go home and let me rest. Diane looked like she wanted to argue. Her mouth opened, then closed. Bryn backed Marin up and said, "Mom, you've done enough damage for one day." Diane's shoulders slumped, and she walked away down the hospital corridor looking smaller somehow, her back hunched like she had aged 10 years. A little later, Dr. Whitlock returned with a tablet displaying my test results and a serious expression on his face. He explained that I was severely stressed, not eating properly, and my blood pressure was dangerously elevated for someone my age. Then he asked directly if I was in a safe living situation and whether the family conflict that brought me there was ongoing. That question broke something in me. I started crying in a way I could not control. Tears ran down my face as I told him about the birthday party and being excluded because I looked like my father. Dr. Whitlock's expression softened from clinical concern into genuine sympathy. He recommended that I follow up with both my regular physician and a therapist, explaining that chronic stress was literally making me sick. He said the collapse was my body's way of forcing me to stop and address what I had been enduring. Bryn sat beside my bed looking guilty, her hand hovering near mine before she finally took it. She admitted she should have confronted our mother years ago instead of taking the path of least resistance. Marin stood on my other side with one hand on my shoulder, steady and solid. Then the door opened again, and Carol walked in, still wearing the kind of dress she had probably worn to Diane's party. Her face was tight with an anger I had never seen directed at her own daughter before. She marched straight to my bedside and took my free hand, her grip firm and warm. She apologized for not speaking up sooner about Diane's treatment of me, her voice shaking with emotion. Bryn looked surprised by the intensity in our grandmother's face. Carol said she had been watching the dysfunction for years, and her silence had made her complicit. She said she should have intervened long ago, instead of hoping Diane would eventually come to her senses on her own. Carol squeezed my hand tighter, and her mouth set into a hard line. She told me she had confronted Diane at the party after realizing I was not there. She had walked right up to her in front of everyone and asked why one of her children had been excluded from a family celebration. Diane had apparently given the same excuse about me looking like my father, and Carol said she told her that was the most pathetic thing she had ever heard from her own daughter. Her voice shook as she described how several cousins and aunts had stopped talking to listen, how Diane's face went red, and how she tried to walk away, but Carol followed her. That was why Nadia and some of the others had been texting me worried messages. They had heard the whole thing, and finally understood that I had not skipped the party. I had been deliberately excluded. Carol said some of them looked ashamed, like they had known it was wrong but had gone along with it anyway. She told me she was staying in town for a few more days, whether Diane liked it or not, and that she was not leaving until she had a proper conversation with her about her behavior. Bryn nodded from her chair, looking relieved that someone had finally said something to our mother's face, instead of just feeling uncomfortable in silence. Around 6 that evening, Dr. Whitlock came back with discharge papers and a serious expression. He went through instructions about rest, eating properly, and following up with my regular doctor within 3 days. He handed me referral information and said my body was sending clear signals I could not ignore anymore. The nurse removed my IV and gave me a printed sheet about stress management that felt useless, but I took it anyway. Bryn immediately said I was staying at her apartment and not going home alone. Marin agreed, before I could even argue. She had already texted herself my apartment key code, so she could bring over clothes and anything else I needed. Carol announced that she was extending her hotel stay, making it clear from her tone that this was not up for discussion. The nurse wheeled me out in a wheelchair even though I could walk, because apparently that was hospital policy. Bryn brought her car around to the pickup area while Marin followed in her own car so she could go to my apartment. The evening air felt cold after being inside the hospital all day, and I realized I was still wearing the same clothes I had collapsed in. Bryn's apartment was smaller than mine, a one-bedroom place with a couch that had seen better days and a kitchen that barely fit 2 people. She hovered while I sat on the couch, asking what I wanted to eat, whether I was comfortable, and if I needed anything. Marin arrived with a bag of my clothes, toiletries, and phone charger. She must have moved fast because she had only been gone about 20 minutes. Bryn ordered Thai food from the place down the street and insisted I eat something substantial. When it arrived, I forced myself to eat pad thai, even though my stomach felt tight. Bryn sat across from me, apologizing over and over for attending the party and for not pushing back harder when Mom decided to exclude me. She said she should have boycotted in solidarity. She should have made a statement by refusing to go. I told her I was not angry at her, but I was hurt that she had chosen to go instead of standing with me. The words came out flat and tired. Bryn's face crumpled, and she admitted she had been scared of losing her relationship with Mom too. She had been scared that if she took my side, she would become the rejected child. She said she realized now how cowardly that was, choosing the easier path while I dealt with the rejection alone. I did not argue with her because she was right, and we both knew it. Marin stayed over that first night too. Bryn gave me the bedroom, Marin took the couch, and Bryn used a sleeping bag on the floor. They both refused to hear any argument about it. We stayed up late, with me standing in the bedroom doorway, Marin on the couch, and Bryn on the floor, talking about all the years of rejection I had endured. I found myself describing moments I had not thought about in years, like the time I made honor roll in 8th grade, and Diane barely glanced at my report card before going back to watching TV with Bryn, or my high school graduation, when she took one photo of me and about 40 of Bryn, even though our milestones were supposed to matter equally. Marin listened without interrupting, her face getting harder with every story. Finally, she said, "You've been living in survival mode. You've been trying to prove you deserve basic parental affection that should have been freely given." The words hit something in my chest, and I started crying again. Bryn sat up in her sleeping bag and said she had never fully understood how bad it was. From her perspective, Mom had just been stricter with me, not completely rejecting me. I explained the difference between strict and absent, between high expectations and emotional abandonment. I told them about the year I got pneumonia in 10th grade, when Diane dropped me at the clinic and left to take Bryn to a tournament. I sat in the waiting room alone with a fever, reading old magazines until a nurse asked where my parent was. I told them about my 15th birthday, when Diane forgot until 8 at night, then handed me a gift card she had clearly bought at the gas station on the way home, with the receipt still in the bag. Bryn covered her face with both hands and said she remembered that tournament. She had never once thought about where I was. Marin said the cruelty of it was in the small things, the steady drip of being treated like an afterthought. A single big rejection is almost easier to point at than 15 years of being made to feel optional. I told them the worst part was not even the cold moments themselves. It was the way I had learned to expect them. The way I trained myself to ask for less and less until asking for anything at all felt like a burden I was placing on people. We talked until almost 2 in the morning before exhaustion finally won. The next morning, Bryn's phone started ringing around 8. She was in the kitchen making coffee, and I heard her decline the call. It rang again and again until she finally put it on silent and brought me coffee in bed, looking stressed. Around 9, a text came through loud enough that I heard the buzz from the other room. Bryn read it aloud from the doorway, her voice flat. Diane wanted to know if I was okay. She needed to know I was all right. Bryn typed back that I was alive and recovering, but Mom needed to give me space. Another text came through within seconds asking when Diane could see me. Bryn looked at me, and I shook my head. She texted back that it was my decision to make, not Diane's. After that, the phone went quiet, and Bryn set it face down on the counter like she could not stand to look at it anymore. Marin made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, and I ate because she watched me with an expression that meant she would not take no for an answer. Around noon, there was a knock on Bryn's door, and Nadia was standing there with flowers. White daisies, a cheap grocery store bouquet, but her eyes were red and puffy like she had been crying. Bryn let her in, and Nadia came straight to me on the couch, setting the flowers down and apologizing for posting the party invitation where I could see it. She said she had not realized I was not invited until Carol made that scene at the party. The words tumbled out fast, like she had been practicing them. She told me she felt sick knowing I had found out through social media, through her post specifically. Nadia admitted several cousins had talked during the party about how wrong it was. They had stood in small groups whispering about Diane's cruelty, but no one had actually left in protest. She said she regretted that now. She wished someone had walked out and made a real statement instead of just feeling uncomfortable while eating cake. I thanked her for coming and told her I did not blame her for the Instagram post. The invitation was not the problem. Diane's choice to exclude me was the problem, and Nadia's post had only made it visible. She cried a little, hugged me, and promised to check in later. I spent the next few days at Bryn's apartment, sleeping more than I had in months. Marin took time off work to stay with me, setting up camp on Bryn's couch with her laptop and working remotely when she needed to. We had long conversations about family trauma, about the difference between forgiveness and letting people continue to hurt you. Marin talked about boundaries and self-protection in a way that made sense, like she had thought about it a lot. Eventually, she told me she had cut off her own toxic parent 3 years earlier, her mother, who had criticized everything she did and made her feel worthless. Marin said she had not regretted choosing her mental health over a destructive relationship. When I asked if she ever missed her, she said, "Sometimes, but I miss the mother I wished I had, not the one who actually existed." The distinction felt important, and I wrote it down in my phone notes so I would not forget. Carol called on the third day and asked if she could visit. She showed up an hour later with homemade chicken and rice soup in a container that smelled like comfort. Bryn heated it up while Carol sat beside me and talked honestly about Diane's behavior. She said Diane had been devastated when my father left, completely broken by the betrayal, but that her choice to punish me for his actions was inexcusable. Carol said she was ashamed she had not intervened more forcefully years ago. She had watched Diane reject me and told herself Diane just needed more time to heal. She admitted she had enabled the behavior by staying silent, by not calling Diane out every single time she treated me like I was invisible. Carol's voice cracked when she said watching Diane reject her own child had been one of the most painful experiences of her life. She said she had failed both of us by hoping Diane would eventually come around on her own. She kept talking, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea Bryn had made her, and revealed she had been in therapy herself for the past year, working through her guilt about enabling Diane by staying quiet. She explained that she had thought giving Diane space to grieve would eventually lead to healing, but instead, Diane's pain had calcified into permanent rejection. That word stayed with me. Calcified. It was exactly right. Like her hurt had turned to stone and trapped me underneath it. Carol said she was done protecting Diane from the consequences of her choices. She had told Diane that her relationship with her depended on Diane getting help and making genuine amends to me. She was not asking anymore. She was telling her. Bryn looked surprised by Carol's intensity, like she was seeing our grandmother differently than she ever had before. On Thursday morning, 3 days after the collapse, Bryn drove me to my follow-up appointment with my regular doctor, just like Dr. Whitlock had ordered. My doctor reviewed the ER report carefully and asked detailed questions about my stress levels, eating habits, and sleep patterns. She was blunt in a way I appreciated. She told me I was showing signs of chronic stress disorder, and if I did not make major changes, I was at risk for serious health problems. She listed possible consequences: heart problems, digestive issues, immune system breakdown. The words were scary enough to take seriously. She referred me to a therapist who specialized in family trauma, writing down a name and number on her prescription pad. She also wrote a note recommending that I take medical leave from work for 2 weeks, saying my body needed time to recover and I needed space to address what had been making me sick. Bryn drove me back to her apartment in silence. Both of us were processing what the doctor had said, that my health was in actual danger because of the stress Diane had caused. 2 days later, Bryn drove me back to my own apartment and helped me carry in the bags Marin had packed. When I unlocked my door, the first thing I saw was my fridge, covered in bright sticky notes. Marin's handwriting was on every one. "You've got this" was stuck to the orange juice. "Proud of you" was on the yogurt container. "One day at a time" was on the milk. She had stocked the fridge with easy meals, pre-made salads, sandwich stuff, and frozen dinners I only needed to heat up. Bryn put my bags in the bedroom and asked 3 times if I was sure I would be okay alone before she finally left. The apartment felt different after everyone was gone, quieter in a way that made my chest tight. I put away the groceries Marin had bought and found more notes tucked everywhere, in the silverware drawer, taped to the bathroom mirror, stuck to my laptop. I made it through unpacking and eating a few crackers before I sat at my kitchen table and started crying for no specific reason except everything. The tears came in waves over the next 2 days. I cried while folding laundry, while watching TV, while brushing my teeth. I realized I had been mourning my mother's love for 15 years while she was still alive and living 20 minutes away. Somehow that felt worse than if she had actually died, because at least then I could have blamed fate instead of her choice. Marin came by every evening to check on me and brought more food even though the fridge was already full. She sat with me through the crying and did not try to fix anything. She just handed me tissues and reminded me that grief was supposed to hurt this much. 3 days after coming home, I drove to the address my doctor had given me for my first therapy appointment with Dr. Hale. The building was plain brick with a small parking lot, and I sat in my car for 10 minutes before going inside, because walking through that door felt like admitting I needed help. I could not give myself. The waiting room had uncomfortable chairs, magazines nobody actually read, and a white noise machine that was supposed to make everything feel private but mostly made the whole room feel muffled. Dr. Hale came out exactly on time. She was a woman maybe in her 50s, with gray hair and kind eyes that did not look sorry for me, which I appreciated. Her office had a couch, but I chose the chair because the couch felt too much like TV therapy. She asked me to tell her what had brought me there, and I started with the birthday party, then the collapse, and then I realized I needed to go back further if she was going to understand why it mattered so much. I talked for probably 30 minutes straight. I told her about being 12 and watching my father leave. I told her about the driving lessons Diane gave Bryn, but not me. I told her about every Mother's Day, where I tried so hard and got so little back. Doctor. Hale listened without interrupting and took a few notes, but mostly she watched my face like she was reading something written there. When I finally stopped talking, she was quiet for a minute before asking what I wanted from my relationship with Diane going forward. The question caught me off guard because I realized I did not actually know anymore. What I had wanted was for her to love me, but she had made it clear that was not going to happen in the way I needed. I told Dr. Hale that, and my voice cracked on the word love because saying it out loud made it more real. She leaned forward slightly and explained something about accepting reality versus accepting mistreatment. She said I could acknowledge Diane's limitations, that she was damaged by what my father had done and probably always would be, while still protecting myself from her rejection. She asked me to think about what a relationship with Diane might look like if I stopped trying to earn her love and instead set clear boundaries about respectful treatment. The idea made something loosen in my chest and tighten at the same time. It felt like liberation and terror mixed together. Liberation, because it meant I could stop performing, stop trying so hard, and stop waiting for Diane to suddenly see me. Terror, because it meant giving up the hope that had kept me trying for 15 years. It meant accepting that the mother-child relationship I wanted might never exist. Doctor. Hale wrote something in her notebook and told me hope was not always healthy when it kept us accepting harm. Sometimes, she said, the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is grieve what we'll never have so we can build something different with what's actually possible. I left her office feeling wrung out and somehow lighter, like I had been carrying something heavy and had not realized I was allowed to put it down. On the drive home, I found myself crying at a red light. Not the sharp kind of crying from the hospital, but something slower, like pressure that had been building for years, was finally finding somewhere to go. I sat in the parking lot of my building for a while before going up, watching people walk dogs and carry groceries, ordinary people living ordinary evenings. I thought about how much of my life had been organized around a single question, whether Diane would ever decide I was worth loving. And for the first time, I wondered if the question itself had been wrong all along. That evening, Bryn called while I was heating one of Marin's frozen meals. Her voice sounded careful when she said Diane had been asking her to set up a meeting. Diane claimed she wanted to apologize and explain herself. Bryn asked what I wanted her to say. I stared at my dinner spinning in the microwave while I thought about it. Then I told her I was not ready to see Diane yet. Being in the same room with her felt impossible. But I said I was willing to read a letter if Mom wanted to write one, something where she had time to think about what she wanted to say instead of just reacting. Bryn agreed to pass that along, but warned me that Mom was not great at expressing emotions in writing or any other format. I could hear the doubt in her voice, like she was already preparing me for disappointment. 4 days later, Bryn showed up at my apartment with an envelope in her hand and skepticism all over her face. She handed it to me without saying anything, and I could tell from the way she stood there that she either had already read it or knew what was inside. I opened the envelope and pulled out a single page. Diane's handwriting was cramped and uneven, like she did not write by hand much anymore. The letter was short and awkward, 3 paragraphs that started with her acknowledging she had handled things poorly. She wrote that she had never meant to hurt me so badly. She wrote that seeing me collapse had scared her and made her realize she had been too hard on me. She said she knew she should have done better. I read it twice, searching for something more, some real acknowledgement of the 15 years, but it was not there. The letter focused on her fear when I collapsed, her pain about the divorce, her struggle with seeing my father's face every time she looked at me. Everything centered on her feelings, her experience, her hurt. There was no real apology for excluding me from the party. There was no real apology for the lifetime of rejection that had led to my body shutting down in her kitchen. I put the letter on my coffee table, and Bryn sat next to me waiting. The letter felt inadequate and defensive, like Diane was trying to explain away her behavior instead of taking responsibility for it. Bryn said she had told Diane the letter needed to be better, but Mom had insisted on sending it anyway. I took the letter to Dr. Hale at my next session. She read it carefully, her pen hovering over certain phrases. She pointed out all the ways Diane minimized her behavior, how she said she had been too hard on me instead of acknowledging that she rejected me, how she focused on her fear about my collapse instead of the harm that caused it. Dr. Hale asked what I needed to hear that was not in the letter. I realized I needed Diane to say she was wrong, not just that she handled things poorly. I needed her to say I did not deserve her rejection, that it was not my fault I looked like my father, that she had robbed us both of a mother-child relationship because of her own unresolved pain. Dr. Hale suggested I write a response letter, saying exactly what I needed, whether I sent it or not. Sometimes writing what we wish we could say helps us understand what we're actually asking for, she told me. Writing my response took 3 days and multiple drafts scattered across my kitchen table. The first version was too nice. It still tried to protect Diane's feelings and make her feel better about being a terrible mother. I threw it away and started over. The second version was all anger, pages of rage about every time she had looked through me like I did not exist. But that did not feel quite right either. The third draft got closer to honest. I wrote about being 12 years old and losing both parents, even though one of them was still alive. I wrote about watching Diane celebrate Bryn while barely acknowledging my existence. I wrote about the birthday party being the final proof that I would never be enough no matter what I did. I wrote that I had deserved a mother who could separate me from her ex-husband, and that her failure to do that was her responsibility, not mine. I wrote that her pain did not excuse the damage she caused. I wrote that I was a child who needed her, and she chose her grief over her own child. By the fourth draft, I was crying, but the words felt true. They were less concerned with protecting Diane and more focused on saying what had actually happened. I printed the letter, read it 3 times, and sealed it in an envelope. Bryn came over to pick it up, and I asked her to read it first. She sat on my couch while I watched her face change as she went through it, her eyes getting wet halfway down the first page. When she finished, she put the letter down carefully and admitted she had never fully understood how bad it had been for me. She said she knew Mom was harder on me, but she had not realized it felt like complete rejection because from her perspective, Mom was still physically there at family dinners and holidays. I explained that physical presence without emotional connection could sometimes be worse than absence because it was a constant reminder of what you were not receiving. Bryn wiped her eyes and said she was sorry for all the times she had not spoken up, for taking the easy path of being the favorite instead of questioning why there had to be a favorite at all. Bryn folded the letter back into the envelope and promised to deliver it. I told her to make clear to Diane that I did not want an immediate response. I needed her to actually sit with what I had written instead of just reacting defensively. Bryn agreed and said she was going to have her own conversation with Mom about the favoritism and how it had damaged both of us, even if Bryn had been the preferred child. She admitted she had been reading about family dynamics since my collapse and realized she had benefited from the same system that harmed me, which made her complicit even though she did not create it. When Bryn left with my letter, I felt both relieved that I had finally said everything and terrified of what would happen next. 3 days later, Bryn called to tell me Diane wanted to respond. I was at work when the call came, and I stepped outside because I needed air for that conversation. Bryn said she had told Diane I needed more time before any direct communication, so a response letter would be fine, but nothing more yet. Her voice got quieter when she described Diane's reaction to reading my letter. Apparently, Mom had broken down crying. She told Bryn she had never understood how deeply she hurt me and did not know how to fix it. Diane kept saying she thought I knew she still cared, even if she could not show it. She said she assumed I understood her coldness was about my father and not about me. Bryn reported all of this without sugarcoating it, then added that Mom's tears did not erase 15 years of damage, and crying was the bare minimum response to realizing you had emotionally abandoned your child. I thanked Bryn for being honest and for backing up my boundaries with Diane. After we hung up, I sat in my car in the work parking lot thinking about Diane crying over my letter. I wondered whether her tears meant anything or whether they were just another way of making the situation about her pain instead of the harm she had caused. The next day, Carol texted asking if I could meet her for lunch at the diner near her hotel. I drove there with my hands shaking on the wheel, not sure what she was going to say, but knowing I needed to hear it. She was already sitting in a booth when I arrived, looking smaller than usual in her travel clothes. She stood and hugged me tightly, longer than she usually did, and something broke loose in my chest. We sat down and ordered coffee, and Carol did not waste time getting to the point. She told me she had been calling Diane every day since the party, having conversations she should have had years ago. Diane kept trying to talk about how much pain she was in from the divorce, how seeing me brought it all back. Carol said she cut her off every single time and told her to focus on my pain instead, the pain of being rejected by my own mother for 15 years. Diane did not like that. She got defensive and said Carol did not understand what it had been like when my father left. Carol told me she kept saying the same thing back to Diane over and over. She understood exactly what it was like because she had watched it happen, but that did not excuse what Diane had done to me. Carol said Diane cried during those calls and asked why everyone was suddenly against her. Carol told her nobody was against her. They were just finally being honest about what they had watched her do to her own child. Carol admitted she was angry at herself for staying quiet all those years, for thinking that giving Diane space and time would somehow fix things. She said she had enabled Diane's behavior by showing up to family events and pretending everything was normal when it was not. I asked her why she was doing this now. Carol looked at me with wet eyes and said watching me collapse in Diane's kitchen had scared her into realizing that silence makes you part of the problem. She told me she was committed to holding Diane accountable, even if it damaged their relationship, because she would rather lose her daughter than watch her destroy her own child any longer. The next week, during my regular therapy session, I told Dr. Hale about Diane's first letter and how inadequate it felt. I told her it focused on Diane's feelings instead of the harm she caused. Dr. Hale asked what real accountability would look like coming from Diane, what I would need to see beyond apologies and tears. I realized I did not actually know because I had never thought about it in concrete terms. I had just been hoping she would magically become the mother I needed, without defining what that meant. Dr. Hale pulled out a notepad, and we started making a list together. I needed changed behavior over time, not just emotional reactions when she was confronted. I needed Diane to stop making comments about how I looked like my father and to never compare me to Bryn in ways that made me feel lesser. I needed her to acknowledge birthdays, holidays, and important events without me having to beg for basic recognition. Dr. Hale wrote all of that down and then added things I had not thought of. I needed Diane to take responsibility for specific incidents from my childhood, to name them out loud and admit they were wrong. I needed her to do her own therapy work on her unresolved grief instead of making me carry the weight of her pain. I needed her to demonstrate consistent effort for months, not just weeks, before I considered letting her back into my life in any real way. Dr. Hale looked at me seriously and said, "Diane may not be capable of meeting these requirements. Some people aren't willing or able to do the deep work required to change patterns that have lasted 15 years. She told me I needed to prepare for the possibility that Diane would try for a while and then give up when it became too hard, or that she would meet some requirements but not others. The most important thing, she said, was that I was clear about my boundaries and stuck to them, even if that meant accepting that a relationship with my mother might not be possible." Marin came over that weekend to help me turn those therapy insights into an actual document. We sat at my kitchen table with her laptop and started drafting a list of boundaries and requirements for any future relationship with Diane. Marin was good at this, at taking my messy thoughts and turning them into clear statements that did not leave room for misinterpretation. We wrote that Diane needed to attend therapy with a counselor who specialized in grief and family problems, and that she needed to stick with it for at least 6 months before I would consider regular contact. We listed specific incidents from my childhood that she needed to acknowledge and apologize for, like missing my high school writing award ceremony and barely speaking to me at my college graduation. We wrote that she needed to make a genuine effort to see me as my own person separate from my father, which meant no more comments about my appearance or mannerisms that connected me to him. Marin suggested adding a requirement about how Diane treated me in front of other family members, because private apologies did not mean much if she was still cold to me at family gatherings. We included that she needed to acknowledge special occasions like birthdays and holidays without me reminding her or begging for inclusion. The list ended up being 2 full pages of specific, clear requirements. We read each one out loud to make sure Diane could not twist it or argue around it the way she had always twisted things, turning conversations about her behavior into conversations about her pain. Marin kept pushing me to be more specific whenever I got vague. When I wrote that Diane should be kinder, Marin made me define kindness. It meant she greeted me when I arrived. It meant she asked me a question and listened to the answer. It meant she did not mention my father, my face, or my mannerisms even once. Where I wrote that Diane needed to acknowledge the past, Marin made me list actual incidents by name and as close to date as I could remember. The pneumonia, the gas station gift card, the writing award, the graduation. There would be no room for Diane to offer a general apology that cost her nothing. As we worked, I realized I had never once in my life asked Diane for something specific and held the line when she pushed back. My whole relationship with her had been built on me, quietly lowering my expectations until there was almost nothing left to disappoint. Marin read through the list one more time and said something that surprised me. She pointed out that I was not asking for perfection or demanding that Diane become a completely different person overnight. I was asking for basic respect and genuine effort to repair what she had broken. If she can't meet these requirements, Marin said, then she doesn't deserve to be in your life. That's her loss, not yours. I gave the list to Bryn and asked her to deliver it to Diane. Bryn read through it carefully, nodding at different points, then folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She drove to Diane's house that evening, while I waited at home feeling sick with nerves. 2 hours later, Bryn called to report how it went. She said Diane had read through the entire list twice without speaking, just sitting at her kitchen table with an overwhelmed look on her face. When she finally spoke, she asked if the requirements were negotiable. Bryn told her no. These were the bare minimum for me to even consider having a relationship with her. Diane asked if there was anything she could do right away to prove she was serious about changing. Bryn told her the best thing she could do immediately was start looking for a therapist and stop making this about her timeline for fixing things. Bryn backed up every single point on my list. She told Diane that if she could not meet those basic requirements, then she did not deserve to have me in her life. Diane got defensive at one point and said some of the requirements seemed harsh. Bryn shut that down fast. 15 years of rejection is harsh, she told her. This list is asking for basic human decency. Diane did not argue after that. Bryn said she left the list on the kitchen table and told Diane to really think about whether she was willing and able to do the work, because I was not going to accept half measures or temporary effort. Bryn told me she was proud of me for being so clear about what I needed, and she promised to keep backing me up with Diane no matter how uncomfortable it became. 2 weeks after my collapse, I went back to work. My manager knew a basic version of what had happened, that I had experienced a medical emergency related to family stress. She told me to take things at my own pace and let her know if I needed accommodations. My coworkers who knew me well noticed something different about me right away. I was more guarded than I used to be, less willing to go along with things just to keep the peace. But I was also more grounded somehow. Like I had stopped floating and finally landed somewhere solid. I told a few people a simple version of the story, that I had a falling out with my mother and it got bad enough that I ended up in the hospital. They were supportive without being nosy, which I appreciated. Having work to focus on helped me feel less consumed by the family situation. There was something normal and steady about sitting at my desk and working through my task list, solving problems that had clear solutions. I was grateful for the routine, for somewhere to go where people expected me to be competent and professional instead of broken and dramatic. My manager pulled me aside after my first week back and said she had noticed I seemed different, but in a good way. She said I was setting better boundaries with difficult clients and not letting people walk over me like I used to. I realized she was right. Something had shifted when I finally stood up to Diane. I had stopped being willing to accept scraps of respect from anyone. During my second week back at work, Nadia texted me. She said Diane had been calling different family members asking for therapist recommendations, which surprised everyone because Diane had never been the type to admit she needed help. Nadia said the family was watching closely to see if she actually followed through, or if this was just a temporary reaction to being confronted. She added that several relatives had been calling Diane directly to tell her that her treatment of me was wrong. Our aunt had apparently had a long conversation with her and told her she was ashamed of how Diane had acted toward me all these years. Our uncle said something similar, telling Diane that excluding me from the birthday party was cruel and that everyone there had felt uncomfortable about it. Nadia said there was a family consensus forming that Diane needed to make serious changes if she wanted to repair these relationships. It was not just about me anymore. People were realizing they had been complicit by staying silent, and they were speaking up now even though it was uncomfortable. Nadia apologized again for not saying something sooner and for posting the party invitation without realizing how it would hurt me to see it. I told her I was not mad at her. The invitation was not the problem. Diane's decision to exclude me was the problem, and the invitation had only made that decision visible to everyone else. 3 weeks after I gave Diane my list of requirements, Bryn told me Diane had started therapy. She had found a counselor who worked with grief and family problems, and she had been going to weekly appointments. Bryn said Diane talked about the sessions sometimes and admitted they were harder than she expected. The therapist was making her look at things she had been avoiding for 15 years, helping her understand how much of her anger at my father had been transferred onto me. Diane told Bryn she was starting to realize she had never actually dealt with the divorce. She had buried all her feelings and let them turn into a permanent wall between us. Bryn was carefully hopeful about this, but she was realistic too. She reminded me that 3 weeks of therapy did not undo 15 years of damage. We needed to see if Diane could keep it up long term, if she was truly willing to do the deep work, or if she would quit when it became too uncomfortable. Bryn said she was checking in with Diane regularly, asking how therapy was going and whether she was doing the homework her counselor assigned. So far, Diane was showing up consistently, which was more than Bryn had expected, but we both knew consistency for a few weeks was different from consistency for months or years. I told Bryn I appreciated her keeping track of it, so I did not have to be in direct contact with Diane yet. Bryn said she was glad to do it. It was the least she could do after all the years she had stayed quiet about the favoritism. Around that same time, my sessions with Dr. Hale started shifting focus. She told me we needed to work on my own healing, separate from whether Diane changed or not. I could not make my mental health dependent on Diane's willingness to attend therapy or meet my requirements. We started doing exercises where I practiced being kind to myself and challenging the belief that I was somehow responsible for earning basic parental love. Dr. Hale had me write letters to my younger self, the 12-year-old who lost her father and then lost her mother even though her mother was still alive. She had me imagine what I would say to that child if I could go back in time. I wrote things like, "You didn't do anything wrong. Her rejection is not about you. You deserved better than this." Reading those letters out loud in therapy made me cry every time, but it also helped something inside me shift. I was starting to understand on a deeper level that Diane's rejection had never been about my worth as a person. It had always been about her inability to deal with her pain in healthy ways. She chose to make me the target of her unprocessed grief, instead of doing the work to heal from my father's betrayal. That was her choice and her failure, not mine. Dr. Hale said that understanding was crucial because it meant I could stop trying to fix myself into someone Diane could love. "You were always lovable," she told me. She was just too damaged to see it. As Thanksgiving got closer, I told Bryn I was not ready to attend any family gathering that included Diane. The thought of sitting at a table with her and pretending everything was fine made me feel sick. Bryn understood, but she admitted she was torn about what to do for the holiday. She wanted to support me, but she also did not want to completely cut off contact with Diane, especially now that Diane was actually trying to change. We decided Bryn would do a brief visit with Diane on Thanksgiving, maybe stop by her house for an hour, but then she would spend the main meal with me, Marin, and some friends. Bryn made it clear to Diane that this was the arrangement, that she was splitting her time and Diane needed to accept that. Carol called me and announced she was spending Thanksgiving with me and my chosen family instead of with Diane. She said she was sending Diane a clear message about where her priorities were that year. Diane apparently got upset when Carol told her and said it felt like everyone was abandoning her. Carol told her that was what it felt like to face consequences for your actions. And maybe now she could understand a fraction of what she had put me through. I was grateful to have Carol, Bryn, and Marin all choosing to spend the holiday with me. It made me feel less alone, less like I was the problem everyone had to work around. Thanksgiving ended up being one of the best holidays I had had in years. Marin hosted at her apartment, and we invited a few other friends who did not have family nearby. Bryn and Carol came over after Bryn's brief visit with Diane. We cooked together, made too much food, and laughed about our terrible cooking skills. Someone suggested we go around the table and share what we were grateful for, which usually felt cheesy, but that year it hit differently. When it was my turn, I found myself saying, "I'm grateful for the collapse." Everyone looked surprised, so I explained, passing out in Diane's kitchen had forced everything into the open. It made all the dysfunction visible in a way nobody could ignore anymore. I was grateful for the people who showed up for me in the hospital and after, people who did not make excuses for Diane or tell me to just forgive and move on. Marin teared up and squeezed my hand. Bryn said she was grateful I was still there and that I had finally told her how bad things really were. When Carol's turn came, she told stories about Diane as a child. Things I had never heard before. She talked about how sensitive Diane used to be, how deeply she felt everything, how she used to cry at sad movies. Carol said, somewhere along the way, Diane had learned to turn all her feelings into anger, and that anger had destroyed her relationship with me. Hearing those stories helped me see Diane as a whole person, flawed and human, instead of only as the mother who had rejected me. It did not excuse what she did, but it made it easier to hold her accountable while letting go of some of the anger. By the end of the night, I felt full in a way that had nothing to do with food. I felt connected to people who actually saw me and chose me, and that was worth more than any relationship based on obligation or guilt. The card showed up in my mailbox the day after Thanksgiving, a plain white envelope with Diane's handwriting on the front. I stood there holding it, not sure if I wanted to open it or throw it away. Marin was inside cleaning up from the day before, and I could have tossed it in the trash and never mentioned it. But I opened it anyway. Inside was a simple card with a turkey on the front, and Diane's messy handwriting inside. She wrote that she was grateful I was alive and that she was working on herself in therapy. She wrote that she had a lot to learn about being a better mother. The note was short, maybe 3 sentences total, but it did not make excuses or blame me for anything. Bryn called that evening and told me Diane had spent most of Thanksgiving at Carol's house, but left early, barely eating anything. Bryn said Diane looked uncomfortable the whole time, like she finally understood that her choices had consequences and nobody was going to pretend everything was fine just to make her feel better. I put the card in a drawer and tried not to think about it too much. December started cold and gray, the kind of weather that made me want to stay inside all day. Bryn stopped by my apartment one Saturday afternoon with coffee and told me Diane had asked her therapist about family therapy. She wanted to know whether it might help our relationship and whether I would be open to it eventually. I told Bryn I needed to see more sustained change from Diane first. 3 weeks of therapy did not erase 15 years of rejection. Bryn nodded and said she understood. She had told Diane the same thing. I brought it up with Dr. Hale at my next appointment, and she explained that family therapy could be helpful, but only if both people were genuinely committed to change. She said it should not be used to pressure the hurt person into reconciliation before they were ready. Some therapists, she warned, pushed forgiveness too soon because it looked like progress. I told her I was not ready for that yet, and she said that was completely reasonable. The rest of December became about focusing on my own healing instead of waiting to see what Diane did next. Marin and I started cooking dinner together every Tuesday night, trying new recipes and talking about our weeks. She told me about job stress and dating disasters, and I told her about therapy and the slow process of rebuilding my sense of self. Bryn came over more often too, and our conversations went deeper than they ever had before. She admitted she had always known Diane treated me differently, but she had not realized how much it hurt because, from her perspective, Diane had still shown up to family events. I told her again that physical presence without emotional connection could be worse than absence because it was a constant reminder of what you were not getting. Bryn got quiet and said she should have spoken up years ago, that her silence made her part of the problem. Carol called every few days just to check in, asking how I was doing without making it about Diane. She told me about her friends in Florida, the book club she had joined, and what she was learning in her own therapy. I was discovering what it felt like to have family members who prioritized my well-being without conditions attached. One Tuesday, Marin and I attempted a complicated curry that turned into a disaster. The kitchen filled with smoke, the rice burned to the bottom of the pot, and we ended up laughing so hard I had to sit down on the floor. I realized I could not remember the last time I had laughed like that before everything happened. I started sleeping through the night again. I started eating real meals instead of crackers over the sink. Dr. Hale gave me a small assignment to notice one moment each day where I treated myself the way I would treat a friend. At first, I could not find a single one, but by the second week, I caught myself putting a blanket over my own legs on the couch. I bought the good coffee instead of the cheap kind. I told myself it was okay to rest. The notes Marin had left were still on my fridge weeks later because I could not bring myself to take them down. Diane kept going to therapy every week throughout December, and Bryn reported that she seemed to be taking it seriously. She was doing homework assignments her therapist gave her and reading books about grief and family trauma. Bryn said Diane had a breakthrough session in mid-December where she finally connected her rejection of me to her unprocessed rage at my father. The therapist helped her see that she had been punishing me for his choices, using me as a stand-in for her ex-husband, instead of seeing me as my own person. Bryn told me. Diane cried through most of that session, really sobbing in a way Bryn had never seen before. I did not know what to do with that information. I did not know whether it changed anything or whether it was simply Diane finally facing what she should have faced 15 years earlier. 2 days before Christmas, Diane asked Bryn if she could send me a longer letter. I agreed to read it but made no promises about responding. The letter arrived on Christmas Eve in a thick envelope that felt heavy in my hands. I waited until I was alone in my apartment to open it, sitting on my couch with a mug of tea I did not drink while I read. The letter was completely different from her first attempt. It was specific and detailed instead of vague and defensive. Diane wrote about the time I won a writing award in high school, and she did not attend the ceremony because she claimed she had to work, even though Bryn's games never seemed to conflict with her schedule. She mentioned my college graduation, where she barely spoke to me during the celebration, standing on the opposite side of the room while other parents hugged their kids and took pictures. She listed other moments too, small rejections that had added up over the years to communicate that I did not matter to her. Diane acknowledged that these were not isolated incidents, but a pattern of behavior that told me I was not worth her time or attention. On the second page, she took responsibility for choosing her pain over her own child. She wrote that therapy was helping her see how she had made me carry the burden of her unresolved grief, how she had turned me into a symbol of her failed marriage instead of letting me be her child. She wrote that she understood if I never wanted a relationship with her, and that she would not blame me for cutting her out of my life completely. But she wanted me to know that her rejection was never about me. I had done nothing wrong by looking like my father, sounding like him, or existing as proof that he had once loved her. Diane ended the letter by saying she was committed to continuing therapy regardless of whether I forgave her, because she needed to change for herself and not just to earn back my presence in her life. I read the letter 3 times, crying through the second and third readings. I took it to my therapy appointment right after Christmas and showed it to Dr. Hale. She read it carefully and pointed out the significant differences between this letter and the first one. This one demonstrated real accountability without centering Diane's feelings at the expense of mine. Dr. Hale asked how I felt reading it, and I admitted I felt a complicated mix of validation, grief, and cautious hope. The validation came from Diane finally acknowledging specific ways she had failed me, putting words to things I had felt but could not always articulate. The grief was for all the years we had lost, for the mother-child relationship we could have had if she had dealt with her pain in healthy ways. The cautious hope was the scary part because it meant considering that things might actually change. Dr. Hale reminded me that a good letter did not obligate me to reconcile. It was just one piece of evidence I could consider when deciding what kind of relationship I wanted with Diane going forward. Christmas Day felt peaceful in a way holidays had not felt for years. I spent it with Bryn, Marin, and Carol at Bryn's apartment, cooking too much food and watching old movies. Nobody mentioned Diane until late afternoon, when Carol told me she had spent an hour on the phone with her that morning. Carol said Diane was genuinely struggling with the reality of what she had lost. She kept asking whether Carol thought I would ever forgive her. Carol told her she did not know and could not answer for me, but she encouraged Diane to keep doing the work in therapy and respect my timeline instead of pushing for reconciliation on her schedule. After dinner, we played board games, and Marin beat everyone at Scrabble, celebrating like she had won the lottery. I realized I was not anxiously trying to earn Diane's attention or bracing for her coldness. I could simply exist and enjoy time with people who actually wanted me there. Early January brought cold nights that made my apartment windows frost over. One Saturday morning, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a response to Diane's Christmas letter, working through multiple drafts until the tone felt right. I acknowledged that I could see she was making an effort and that her accountability meant something to me. I wrote that I was not ready for direct contact yet, but I was open to the possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship if she continued therapy and demonstrated sustained change over the next several months. I was clear that I would not accept anything less than genuine respect. Comparing me to my father or making me responsible for her emotions would be a deal breaker that ended any attempt at reconciliation permanently. I listed specific requirements again: consistent therapy attendance, acknowledgement of how her behavior affected me, and a willingness to hear my feelings without getting defensive. Bryn picked up the letter from my apartment on Sunday and promised to deliver it to Diane that afternoon. Later that evening, she texted me, saying Diane had read it multiple times and seemed both relieved and sobered by the conditions I had set. Bryn said Diane told her she was grateful I was leaving the door open, even a crack. She understood she had to earn back what she destroyed through years of consistent effort. Diane apparently asked her therapist to help her understand what sustained change actually looked like and how to demonstrate it through actions rather than words. February came, and I noticed something shifting in my therapy sessions with Dr. Hale. We spent weeks working through layers of grief, not just for Diane's rejection, but for the mother I never got to have in the first place. Dr. Hale had me do exercises where I imagined what a healthy mother-child relationship would look like, and then we talked about whether any version of that might be possible with Diane. I was learning to hold two truths at the same time without letting either one take over completely. Diane had hurt me deeply for 15 years, and she was also making genuine efforts to change now. Both things were real, and I did not have to pick only one to believe. The anger that used to fill my chest every time I thought about her started to feel less heavy. Not because I was forgiving her exactly, but because I was building a life that did not revolve around earning her love anymore. Dr. Hale said, "This is what healing looks like when you stop waiting for someone else to fix what they broke and start building something new for yourself instead." In mid-February, Bryn forwarded me an email from Diane after checking that I was okay receiving it. The subject line just said, "Request," and the message was short and careful. Diane wrote that her therapist thought it might be helpful for us to exchange occasional emails as a low-pressure way to start rebuilding communication. She said she understood if I was not ready and would not push, but she wanted to ask. I stared at the email for 20 minutes before forwarding it to Dr. Hale and asking what she thought. We spent most of my next session talking through the pros and cons. Dr. Hale pointed out that Diane asking permission instead of emailing me directly showed some awareness of boundaries. She thought it was reasonable given the progress Diane had shown in therapy, but only if I set clear limits about how often we communicated and what topics were acceptable. I sent back a response saying I was willing to try weekly emails with ground rules. No guilt trips. No comparing me to my father. No making me responsible for her emotions. If she broke those rules even once, I was done. Her reply came within an hour, thanking me and agreeing to everything. Our first real email exchange happened 3 days later, and it was awkward as hell. She wrote about her therapy sessions in vague terms and asked how work was going. I gave short answers about a project I was working on and asked about her house repairs. We sounded like strangers making polite conversation, but at least nobody was crying or yelling. Over the next 6 weeks, we exchanged emails every week or two, and I started noticing changes in how Diane wrote to me. She asked about specific things I had mentioned before, like she was actually paying attention and remembering details. When I told her about a difficult client meeting, she asked follow-up questions, instead of moving on to talk about herself. She mentioned things her therapist was teaching her about listening and staying curious instead of defensive, and I could see her trying to practice it. The emails were still careful and a little stiff, but they felt more real than any conversation we had had in years. Bryn told me Diane treated those emails like they were precious, reading them multiple times before responding and asking Bryn if her replies sounded okay. Bryn said Diane kept a folder of all our exchanges and went back through them when she was having a hard day in therapy. I was still guarded, still watching for signs that she might slip back into old patterns, but part of me started to relax just slightly. It felt strange to have regular contact with Diane that did not leave me feeling terrible afterward. Late March arrived, and I was sitting at my desk when an email from Diane popped up with a different tone than usual. She wrote that it had been almost 4 months since my collapse, and she knew she had no right to ask for more than I was already giving, but she wondered if I would be willing to meet for coffee in a public place with Bryn there as a buffer. She said she understood if it was too much, and would keep working in therapy either way. I stared at the email for 2 days before responding, going back and forth in my head about whether I was ready. Dr. Hale and I spent a whole session working through my fears about seeing Diane face-to-face again. She helped me set clear parameters for the meeting, like keeping it to 1 hour maximum and having a list of topics that were completely off limits. We did role-playing exercises where she pretended to be Diane saying difficult things, and I practiced leaving or redirecting the conversation. Dr. Hale reminded me over and over that I could walk out at any moment if I felt disrespected or overwhelmed. Agreeing to coffee did not obligate me to anything beyond that 1 hour. Marin made me promise to text her the second the meeting ended, so she knew I was safe. Finally, I sent Diane an email saying yes to coffee with very specific conditions attached. Saturday morning came, and I drove to a cafe across town that neither of us ever went to normally. Bryn was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table and looking almost as nervous as I felt. Diane walked in 5 minutes later, and I barely recognized the expression on her face. She looked scared in a way I had never seen before, like she was the one who might be rejected this time. She thanked me for coming before she even sat down, and her voice shook a little when she said she knew how hard this must be for me. We ordered coffee and spent the first 10 minutes talking about nothing important, just weather and traffic and safe topics that did not touch anything real. Bryn did most of the talking at first, filling awkward silences and redirecting when things started to feel tense. Diane asked about my work and actually listened to my answer instead of waiting for her turn to talk. She was careful not to push into personal territory or make the conversation about her feelings and progress. 45 minutes passed before I realized I was no longer counting the minutes until I could leave. When we were done, Diane asked if I would be open to doing this again sometime. I heard myself say, maybe, not yes, not no, just maybe. It felt like the most honest thing I had said to her in years. Bryn called me that evening and told me Diane had broken down crying after I left. She told Bryn the meeting had gone better than she dared to hope, and that she had been terrified I would shut down any possibility of future contact. Bryn said Diane's therapist had been working with her on managing expectations and understanding that rebuilding trust was a process that required time and patience. Diane apparently kept saying she knew she did not get to decide the pace of reconciliation, and that my willingness to even try was a gift she needed to honor instead of taking for granted. I told Bryn I appreciated that Diane seemed to understand one coffee meeting did not fix 15 years of damage. Bryn admitted she was surprised by how much Diane had changed in just a few months. She said she never thought our mother was capable of that kind of self-awareness. April brought more emails and another coffee meeting. This one was without Bryn, because I suggested it after the first meeting went okay. Diane and I sat across from each other at the same cafe and talked for over an hour. She shared more about what she was learning in therapy, including how her own mother had been cold and distant, and how she had never learned healthy ways to process pain. She told me about realizing in one session that she had been using me as a stand-in for my father, punishing me for his choices because she could not reach him anymore. I listened, but I also shared some of my own therapy work about rebuilding self-worth after years of feeling like I had to earn basic love. The conversation felt different from anything we had ever had. It felt more like two adults trying to understand each other than a desperate child begging for scraps. When we left, Diane did not ask about next time, and I appreciated that she was learning to let me set the pace. Carol called a few days later and said she was proud of how I was handling everything with Diane. She told me I was maintaining boundaries while staying open to possibility, not sacrificing my well-being just to make things easier for my mother. Carol said Diane had changed noticeably over the past few months in ways she had not thought were possible. She took more responsibility for her emotions instead of blaming everyone else, and she was more willing to sit with discomfort instead of lashing out to make it stop. Carol was careful to say Diane still had a long way to go and setbacks were likely, but the direction of change felt genuine. She admitted she had not believed Diane was capable of this level of growth when it all started. Watching her actually do the work had been both surprising and encouraging. Early May brought Bryn's birthday, and with it an email from Diane asking if I would be comfortable attending a small family dinner to celebrate. Just Bryn, Diane, Carol, and me. I thought about it for a day before responding that I would come, but if I felt uncomfortable, I could leave without explanation or guilt. Bryn picked me up, and we drove to Diane's house together. I had not been inside since the day I collapsed. The dinner was awkward, but not terrible. Diane made an effort to include me in the conversation and asked about my life with what felt like genuine interest. We were talking about Bryn's new project at work when Diane started telling a story from when Bryn and I were kids, something about Bryn winning a basketball game. Halfway through the story, Diane caught herself because the memory highlighted how she had celebrated Bryn's wins while barely noticing mine. She stopped mid-sentence and apologized immediately, instead of trying to push through or get defensive. That self-awareness felt like real progress, like she was learning to catch her old patterns before they hurt me again. After dinner, Diane asked if she could give me something and disappeared into her office. She came back with a photo album. Not one of the old family albums, but something she had put together herself. She handed it to me and told me to look through it when I was ready. Inside were photos from my childhood that I had never seen before. Me at my 8th grade graduation. Me at a piano recital when I was 10. Me reading on the porch one summer afternoon. Pictures she had taken but never shared with me. Moments she had captured even though she could not show me she was paying attention. Some part of her had been watching, even when she could not be present in the ways I needed. Diane told me she had been going through old photos in therapy, working on separating her memories of me from her memories of my father. Her therapist had her look at pictures of me at different ages and talk about what she saw, trying to see me as my own person, instead of just a reminder of her ex-husband. She was standing close to me then, closer than she had stood in years, and for the first time since I was a child. She looked at my face without flinching, without that old tightening around her eyes, like she was finally seeing the person in front of her instead of the man who left. I held the album against my chest and told her, "This doesn't fix it. Nothing fixes the 15 years. Her eyes filled, but she nodded and said she knew. She was not asking it to. Her face, the same face that had gone cold every time I walked into a room, the same face that could not bear to have me at a birthday party 4 months earlier, was open and wrecked and looking at me like I was the most important person in the room. I kept the album. I got in the car, and as Bryn pulled away from the curb, I watched my mother standing in the doorway of the house where I had collapsed. I did not know exactly what we would become after that. I did not know if trust could ever grow back into something strong enough to hold us, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer the child begging to be seen. I had built a life where I was loved without having to earn it, and if Diane wanted a place in that life, she would have to keep seeing me clearly, not as a ghost of the man who left her, but as the daughter who had stayed far longer than she ever should have had to.